On the behalf of Usanas Foundation, I would like to welcome all of you to our another Usanas Dialogue series. Today, we are going to discuss a very, very critical and important issue, that's India-US relations and charting out the future. In any discourse on geopolitics, India-US relations form a very critical component, not only for India, but in today's changing world order, it's for the world in general. India-US relations are a subject matter of key concern and study. After the Soviet disintegration, India started diversifying its foreign policy, and India-US relationship kind of started after that. But then the 1998 Pokhran blast, the nuclear blast, after that there was a phase of some kind of estrangement and some kind of bitterness between the two countries. But then Clinton visit and the support extended by the US during the Kargil war was indeed something which really gave a good head start to India-US relationship. But then off and on, we have seen that this entire trajectory of India-US relationship, there have been ups and downs. There have been lows and highs. In US war against the terror in Afghanistan, there was a big issue. I mean, the Americans were not very supportive towards India regarding India's concerns of Pakistan's purported terrorism in Kashmir. Though President Musharraf gave a statement in Pakistan on January 12, 2000, I guess, in which he stated that the Pakistan soil would not be used for launching terror operations against any other country. But Pakistan's claim in the future, they turned out to be hollow. After that, this relationship progressed. The major breakthrough came in 2008 with the civilian nuclear deal. And after the civilian nuclear deal, today in the IR discourse, we talk about this phenomenon of Quad. And there is a narrative and a very crucial discourse that in order to contain and in order to check China, India needs to build a very strong relationship with the US. However, as these narratives get stronger, whenever we start talking about them, something or the other happens that kind of brings forth the rift between and the distrust between the two countries. Of late, what happened in this Hardeep Singh Nijjar case, and also so from the certain American quarters, various concerns and issues came about the condition of minorities in India, and also the allegations of democratic backsliding. So all these things have created some sort of a discomfort, and I think on an average we can say that that there is some kind of a distrust prevailing between the two countries. Though among the common people, American dream is still something very great, and Indians love to pursue that. But at an official level, still there are issues and there are concerns which we need to discuss. So today we are joined by a very esteemed panel in which we have amazing experts. We have Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, and we have Mr. Kaush Ara, who is a senior fellow at Atlantic Council, and Dr. Michael Rubin, who has been a frequent speaker at Usanas Foundation's events, and of course, Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, our senior advisory board member and a mentor, friend, philosopher of Usanas Foundation. He is going to chair today's session, and I'll introduce him. He'll introduce the rest of the speakers and our esteemed panelists. Ambassador Anil Trigunayat is a member of Usanas Advisory Board, and he has served as India's envoy to Libya, Malta, and Jordan. Today, he is one of the most prolific writers on international relations, foreign policy, and security issue, and one of the most inspiring figure for the young IR enthusiast. Sir, we are very lucky to have you today with us. Now I'll hand it over to you to start this dialogue, today's webinar. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Abhinav. And
just one more thing, sir. Just one more thing. Sorry for the little interruption. Yes. So today we have also chosen this occasion to launch our annual report of 2023-2024. We did some really nice events over the last year. You're very familiar with all of them. A lot of webinars, and also a Maharana Pratap annual geopolitics dialogue. That's a flagship annual foreign policy event in partnership with the Ministry of External Affairs. And definitely the year has been very eventful year for us, full of achievements. Though we are a very small think tank, but still we can proudly say that with God's grace and our Guru's grace, we have created a niche, created a space for ourselves in this IR discourse. So before we start the formal this dialogue today, we would like Ambassador Sibal to launch this report, Usanas Foundation's annual report. Sir, we will request you to say a few words.
Well, I'm very happy that you are focusing on a relationship which is very critical for India's future. as well as for America's own future, frankly. There are a lot of shared equities between the two countries going forward in this very difficult geopolitical landscape with the kinds of challenges both sides are facing. You did outline the past ups and downs in our ties, which only points to the need to maintain a dialogue between the two countries at the highest level and try and limit the scope for provocations and misunderstandings and focus on the positives of the relationship and carry it forward. And organizations like yours, I think, are very important in terms of furthering this understanding, and anything that can be done to do that would be a great contribution to India-US ties, because there's a lot of misinformation about India, frankly, in the Western media and the US media in particular. It is up to the Indian American community and foundations like yours, organizations like yours, to correct these misunderstandings to the extent possible. Therefore, I'm very happy to formally launch your report, or your what
Annual
do you call
report,
it?
sir. Annual
Your
report.
annual report on the work you've done during the course of the year, and I wish you all success in the future.
Thank you very much, sir. Our team of youngsters, young experts here have done really amazing work. I would like to congratulate and felicitate Preeti Kheta and Nikita, and also our director, Dr. Anita Jain, for producing this brilliant report. Very soon, we'll also be coming with our report on the Maharana Pratap Annual Geopolitics Dialogue. Now, over to you, Ambassador Trigunath, sir, for the discussion.
Thank you, Abhinav, and thank you, Ambassador Sibal, for launching this report. And Abhinav, you have already given a background to our relationship and how it has progressed and what are some of the glitches that need to be discussed. Moreover, it is a very timely conference, especially now that we have a very highly distinguished and knowledgeable panel. And at a time when Prime Minister Modi had just taken over the third time, and during his very first week, he has met President Biden. And only this week, we have had National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, as well as the other delegates who had very many interesting meetings with National Security Advisor, with Foreign Minister Jaishankar, as well as with called on the Prime Minister. And the indications which are coming is that we not only the ICET, but the whole gamut of our relationship has been discussed. So it is my pleasure and honor to moderate this esteemed panel on to discuss the geometry of the India-US defining partnership in this century. And so I extend a very warm welcome to the distinguished panelists and all the participants from a much hotter Delhi. Allow me to introduce the esteemed panelists. Of course, they're very well known to everyone. Firstly, I would like to introduce Ambassador Kamal Sibal, who was my boss and also our Foreign Secretary. And he also was an ambassador to Turkey, Egypt, France, and Russia. And now he is the Chancellor of Jawaharlal Nehru University. Dr. Sibal is the first Grand Doctor of Philosophy in India. He received the title of full professor from the European Academy of Informatization and the World Information Distributed University, WIDU. In 2017, the Government of India conferred upon him with the Padma Shri Award for his distinguished services in the field of public affairs and diplomacy. Michael Rubin, an old friend, is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He previously worked as an official at the Pentagon, where he dealt with issues relating to the Middle East, and as political advisor to the Coalition Provisional Authority. Since 2007 and 21, he taught senior U.S. Army, U.S. Marine, and U.S. Navy leadership prior to their deployment to Iraq, the Persian Gulf, and Afghanistan as a lecturer at the Naval Postgraduate School. Dr. Kaush Ara is a non-resident senior fellow in the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. He's also a senior visiting fellow at the Crash Institute for Tech Diplomacy at Purdue. He has previously served as United States Agency, USAID, a senior advisor on strategic engagement, where he led the global agency-wide framework to counter malignant actions of US adversaries. He also served as a senior transition advisor at the US Embassy in Kabul, where he coordinated with the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, ISAF, and coalition partners in the completion and execution of the first tranche of the transition energy. We had great discussions with him and his colleagues at the VIF last March, and we look forward to a much interesting discussion on the trajectory of the Indo-US relations. Friends, as you are aware, that the global governance is indeed in crisis. The role of super and hyperpowers are being questioned as the wars continue to rage in a last-ditch effort to hang on to the status quo. No single country can manage these tectonic shifts, which are evident across the spectrum. Global challenges are being undermined for the convenient of myopic geopolitical gains. Multilateral institutions have lost their credibility and competence as well as capabilities, like never before. In such a situation, a sane foreign policy choices are most important, lest we expedite the emergence of a more invidious and unstable Cold War 2.0. India has corrected its economic compass, consolidated its economic and political strength, and is ready to claim a legitimate place in the forefront of the 21st century and aims to become a rule maker or a shaper and not a rule taker any longer. This is a legitimate ambition of the most populous nation, largest democracy, and fastest growing major economy in the world. India-US relationship could be a good pivot for course correction. India, with its sane and principled foreign policy, is trying to emerge as a bridge between the East and the West and North and the South through her strategic autonomy, which could be an anchor in this chaotic world. Of course, it will depend on what chances we are ready to take and what costs we don't mind bearing. There are no free lunches, as we do in the US, but hopefully the US appreciates this quest of India for the larger good of the larger people. Culture of vassal states is being challenged. Like Macron said, and apartheid needs to go in the international discourse, while modus vivendi ought to be promoted. Dealing with non-state actors will be a formidable challenge, as the China plus Russia equal to USA and the West equation is underway, which will fan the fancies of these non-state actors even more. We would need to follow the 3M's approach: mutual respect, mutual interest, and mutual sensitivities to really take the relationship to a much higher orbit. We have a global comprehensive strategic partnership, which has expanded in critical security and technology domains, as USA remains India's biggest trading partner for goods and services. High-level contacts and exchanges are continuing, which underscore the importance of relationship that have been frequent, consistently built up from Modi 1.0 to Modi 3.0, which has just begun, with PM Modi meeting President Biden at G7 summit and other officers only this week for the second ICT meeting, when we have this. Looks like that we have an excellent landscape to work upon. Then, of course, you have Nancy Pelosi in Dharamsala, perhaps gaslighting the Chinese, as India also thinking to changing tracks on Tibet and Taiwan, and third T is our tech collaboration. So far, with a plethora of collaboration and consulting mechanisms which have been duly institutionalized between our two countries to address any issues and challenges, things are moving quite well. With foundational agreements and the special status that India enjoys, critical area collaboration is continuing apace in critical technologies, defense, security, and space. Those wanting to have more information could look at the joint statement issued post-ICT meeting. No country or relationship is perfect, and so is the India-US partnership. Despite several convergences and common strategic necessity issues, and divergences remain, in which case we would learn to adapt to as-is-where basis. Our bilateral, regional, sub-regional, and global partnerships are seen as force for global good, especially with I2U2, IUSU, Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, IMAC, Quad, and the Indo-Pacific, etc. India will be hosting the Quad Summit this year, which again PM Modi calls as a force for the global good, and where India, at least overtly, does not advocate for containment of China. But would the relationship be defined by the Chinese challenge alone is the key question that both sides need to answer. India's relations with Russia, BRICS and SCO, and aversion to alliance mindset, and even a strong and independent leadership in foreign policy are not amenable to the US deep state. Likewise, USA's unilateral sanctions, confusing demarche with China and Pakistan, and provision of arms and assistance, ignoring their complicity with terrorism against India, cast doubt about the sincerity and intent, which appears divergent. And with the global comprehensive strategic partner issues like that of separatists and terrorists like PANU, only smack and perceived as double standards and hypocrisy. And that I can never be wrong syndrome does affect the relationship. Comments on human rights, democracy, etc. fall in that category. Hence, frank talks and understandings are essential, not only at the G2G level, but surely at the P2P level. We have witnessed the raising of amorphous issues through gray zone warfare tactics against India, especially by the West during the preceding Indian elections. And Ambassador Sibal has written about it also. Studies and commentary suggest that they were aimed at undermining the process and affect the voter mindset. We would be naive if we are not adequately prepared for such googlies. No doubt, trust deficit quotient is pretty evident, especially at the grassroots level, which would need to be addressed through an overt dialogue and should be aimed at infusing confidence in this very important relationship. So in today's discussion, while the esteemed panelists will highlight the current and future trajectory of India-US ties, I would request especially our US friends to also dwell upon the following. Since China is a common challenge, and for almost a decade, one of the most anticipated event horizon in the geostrategic space has been the rise of China as a challenger to US supremacy in Asia and the world at large. So history is a mute testament to any such climb of a challenger being disruptive to regional and world peace. China's upsurge is no different. So perhaps following 4 or 5 points I would mention in the beginning may perhaps be addressed. In case of a conflict in the Indo-Pacific, what would be the likely US expectations from India? And to what extent will this be provided? In the event of India-China conflagration, what assistance would US be ready to provide? And to what extent? And how does it see its role in that? How would you see the US policies change if the Republicans come to power in November, or to be precise, in January 2025? According to you, is there a good understanding now in the US establishment as to what drives India's foreign policy? Fourthly, what more should be done, according to you, to create greater trust and heft in the relationship short of an alliance? And lastly, how do we deal with the laws of the unintended consequences? So I would request each panelist to kindly take 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll have Q&As and finally closing remarks by the panelists of a minute each. Now may I request Ambassador Sibal to kindly take the stage.
Well, thank you, Anil. You have summarized very well the various dimensions of the bilateral India-US relationship, the difficulties that we have experienced in the past and the uncertainties that may yet bedevil this relationship in the future. The international landscape, as you rightly pointed out, has become very complex. Multilateralism is not functioning. There is now a version of a new Cold War, with the with the difference that this time the relationship between the United States and China is very different than it was during the period of the Cold War. While there was some political understanding at that time between the United States and China to counter the Soviet Union, the economic ties between the two countries were not of the same dimension as they are today. And of course, the other issues that you mentioned about the United States relationship with Pakistan, also the role of the Western press and the US press in particular during our recent elections, and so on. So I think the comprehensive picture you have given of the positives and negatives of our ties with the United States doesn't leave much scope for any meaningful elaboration, but let me say a few things. One is that the visit of Jake Sullivan at this point in time, immediately after the re-election of Modi for the third term, has a certain symbolic importance apart from the policy importance of this visit. Symbolic importance meaning that they have not wasted time at all in engaging Modi and the new government. And Jake Sullivan has made it a point to come and have the second review meeting, which was to be held earlier this year in January, I think, but got postponed because of the war in Gaza and what have you. So rather than delaying it further and for any reason, and then sending a signal that for some reason the Biden government does not wish to send a very positive supporting message to the new Modi government, which appears to, from some analysis that you see internally and externally, not as strong as before. That kind of interpretation that might have been given to any delay in his coming to India has been avoided, and they're just as well. That's the first point. Second is that this part of our relationship actually is the foundation for a future relationship. The cooperation in the areas of sensitive and critical technologies is absolutely critical for India's modernization, India's role in the world in the future, as well as United States staying ahead of the competition in the technological field and not allowing this to be dominated by China, and using India's resources and human capital and certain capacities we have to address United States' own enormous strengths in this area. Of course, there are hurdles ahead because in terms of critical and emerging technologies, first of all, a lot of work needs to be done. It's not as if once you've had an agreement, you're going to be able to produce breakthrough results very quickly. It needs a lot of time and interaction and research to be able to produce results. And in this, as you know, our defense people and our academic people and our business community is involved, and finding areas of cooperation, financing them, issues of who will own the IPRs, all these issues will be discussed in the future. I attended a meeting a few months ago, which was a kind of a evaluation of what has been able to be achieved after a year of the ICET dialogue, and there the evaluation was not so positive. The feeling was that progress had been slow. The intentions are there, but the practical results have not been too visible. Now, I hope that this time around, in the second year, we'll be able to move forward. But then there is an issue which you mentioned, not in this context, but in general terms, that United States heading into an election, and it's possible that Trump may come back to power. So in this period when the United States is totally involved in the election campaign, how much time they will be able to devote to this element of our bilateral ties and move forward substantially on these issues, which are complex, remains to be seen. And if Trump comes into power, then what happens? And there is also the larger background, which one should not ignore, where the United States, in fact, is creating legislative hurdles in terms of sharing of sensitive technology abroad. And they have passed some legislation in this regard. And that legislation is not aimed at India, of course, but then it does create hurdles within the system about sharing of sensitive technologies. And then there is the role of the Congress. which is again unpredictable because there are always a few senators and congressmen who are pushed by certain anti-Indian lobbies operating in the United States to create hurdles in the advancement of our ties, especially in these sensitive areas, including in the defense areas. We have seen one of the senators try to hold up the agreement on the Reaper UAVs and what have you. That is one aspect. The other is that with the United States, we have to take the good with the bad. And it's not a problem that only India faces. It's a problem that virtually all countries face, including its allies. Because there are elements in which there is very constructive cooperation with the United States, and there are elements in ties which are problematic. Now, you cited Macron in a different context. In fact, he was not. He expressed his unhappiness at the Hiroshima summit, G7 summit, about the manner in which the United States is dealing with China, and he didn't want Europe to be caught into the throes of this conflict, because the United States has its own internal political compulsions to take a certain line on China, and that can very grievously damage the interests of Europe. So if NATO allies, European allies of the United States, who incidentally are aghast at the possibility of Trump coming back to power, have concerns about the future relationship with the United States and its system, then you can imagine that India too would have certain concerns about the directions of US foreign policy, and that brings me to China. Now, it's all well to say that China is now a threat to United States supremacy, but the question that we asked is, who built up China in the first place? It's the United States that built up China. It's the U.S. system. It's the U.S. Wall Street. It's the multinational corporations that have built up China, along with those of its allies, Japan and South Korea, even Taiwan. And they have done it knowing fully well that China was going to be a very, very major challenge, because don't forget, it's not as if they were not aware of the Chinese system. After all, Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, and he's been over-centralizing power in his person and in his group all these years. And he has been scoffing at Western democracy and Western values and everything else. But that has not deterred the United States from building up a relationship with China. Even now, the Treasury Secretary Yellen, who's been visiting China, has been saying, no, we don't want to, break away our economic ties. There's no question of, moving away our supply channels and this and that. All we want to do is de-risking. And the United States also wants to have a military dialogue. Why are they pressing for a military dialogue? Because they don't want a confrontation with China. And now that brings to us. Now, if, as you rightly pointed out, this question about how much are we going to get involved in the US's battles in the Western Pacific, or United States getting involved in the Indian Ocean, these are very relevant questions. I don't think the United States wants at all to go to war with China. And if the situation in the Western Pacific goes out of hand and they're compelled to take some military action, that's a different matter. But in the Indian Ocean, there is no such compulsion that the United States faces of getting involved in a conflict between India and China. India is not looking for a conflict with China. And China, I don't think, is looking for a broad-based conflict with India. Yes, they are looking at a different kind of pressure on India, especially on the border, and making sure that India is kept distracted in South Asia and is not allowed to spread its wings globally as much as we would want to. In other words, delay our rise. But getting into a large-scale conflict with India, I'm not saying it cannot be ruled out, but I think it's highly unlikely. It's much tensions in Western Pacific getting out of hand are much more likely than is the case in the Indian Ocean. As regards, and I'll end here because I'm not timing myself, insofar as the roles that the two sides can play in an eventual conflict, first of all, I will say that the effort on all sides is deterrence. Quad is deterrence. It's not a vehicle for any military confrontation with China. Similarly, AUKUS and everything else, these are various forms of deterrence. But in the Indian Ocean, apart from the United States, there is no other navy that is capable of playing any significant role. Australian Navy, certainly not. Japanese Navy, certainly not. It's the Indian Navy that will play the key and central role insofar as pressure on the maritime lines of communication of China are concerned, and making China aware of its vulnerability and the choke points and everything else. So if India, and we have been saying that we are willing to be a net security provider, if India plays that role, it's a huge boost to United States capacity to face China in the Western Pacific. India doesn't have to go there. There's no need for us to go there. United States is sufficiently strong, and its allies there are sufficiently strong. And if we can play our role in the Indian Ocean now and in the future, if we build up, let's say, more and more the Andaman and Nicobar Islands as a maritime base, which is very close to the Malacca Straits, and we can give, as part of our foundational agreements with the United States, the right for the U.S. Navy and Air Force to use those bases. It's a huge contribution that we are making. In turn, the United States, as we have been asking them to do, and I think there's some progress, I don't know how much, is to give us technology for the underwater domain, in the underwater domain, so that we can actually keep a tab on the Chinese submarines that enter into the Indian Ocean. And what the United States can do, and I end there, is that they must take a more robust position on China's relations with Pakistan. After all, if Gwadar is intended to become a naval base, or Jiwani in Pakistan is intended to be a naval base, which gives China more ingress into the Arabian Sea, which gives them more access to the Middle East, where we are having this ITU-2 and India, Middle East, European corridor. It is not in the US interest to allow China, to allow Pakistan to play the same games they've been playing for so many decades, be very, very close, lips and teeth with China, and also go and beg for US aid to them so that they can confront India. That policy has to change. The United States must take a more robust position on CPEC, and on Myanmar, they should change their policy rather than allowing Myanmar to fall more into the lap of China. And on Bangladesh, it is regrettable that the United States is putting so much pressure on Bangladesh, knowing that our equities in Bangladesh with the Hasina government are very key to stability in our Northeast. So these are some of the issues that are there on the table. But on the whole, the visit of Jake Sullivan has been very positive. They have reviewed the entire gamut of our ties. His call on the Prime Minister has sent a very positive signal, and the Prime Minister has told him, and this has been publicized by our side, that we see our relationship with the United States as a global good, and in his third term, it will be raised to even greater heights. I think that's a very positive message on which I should end my little intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So those very, very comprehensive comments that you made on different dimensions of our relationships and where US can play, but you rightly said, sir, that we should take the good with the bad, and that would explain everything. Since no relationship is perfect or totally complementary, but there are more convergences than divergence, and we hope that we'll be able to communicate it to them. Thank you so much, sir. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Michael Rubin to please share his thoughts.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. I always like talking about this, especially because I see some degree of good news here. And the good news is, from Washington's perspective, that as we go into one of the most chaotic elections which the United States has had since the 1850s, the India-US relationship is one, and perhaps one of the only, sources of stability. No matter who wins, Biden, Trump, or someone from left field, or one of the vice presidential picks if the presidential nominees don't make it to the actual election day. The one thing that is almost certain is that US-India ties are going to remain stable, at least in the short term. And by I mean stable, I don't mean stagnant. I mean they're going to continue to grow at the same pace. The only other country I can think of that is in the situation right now with regard to the United States and its partisan milieu is Cyprus. But India, of course, for many reasons is, I mean, from sheer size, from military partnership, from economy, is just far more important to the United States. Now, a few notes as we go forward. And we hear a lot about China and Russia. And I can certainly understand India's position on this. The one issue, however, that has nothing to do with India, it's internal to China and Russia, that it behooves both the United States and India to pay attention to, is that the thing that China and Russia have most in common is demographic decline. I mean, of course, we know that India has already surpassed China in population according to the United Nations. But the broader report that the United Nations issued was shocking in terms of how far China would decline in terms of population before it stabilized. At the end of the century, China's population is only going to be about half of what it is today. India's population will peak and then shrink, but it's still going to have a good half billion more people than China. And that, of course, has ramifications politically. When it comes to the United States and India, look, there's nothing wrong with self-interest in international relations. And I'm happy to say that self-interest is playing to the advantage of both the United States and India. According to Ambassador Verma, who, of course, was ambassador to India and is now the Deputy Secretary of State, India-US trade was about $20 billion in the year 2000. Now it's an order of magnitude higher than that. That's a good thing. Now, as a former Pentagon official, one issue I always pay attention to is arms sales. Not simply because of the money inherent in selling weapon systems, but I look at arms sales as a metric by which to gauge the future trajectory of relations. Because with arms sales, it's not only about delivery of the weaponry, it's about interoperability, and it's also about long-term, sometimes decades-long training relationships and maintenance relationships. So it's not simply a flash in the pan with regard to one system at one point in time. You're really talking about selling a relationship that can last 20 years. Now, the United States is currently the third largest arms supplier to India after Russia and France. And it accounts for 13% of India's weapons. It has accounted for 13% of India's weapon imports between 2019 and 2023. The reason why that is actually important, that figure, is that's about, I mean, we have increased the share of US weaponry to India at the same time that Russia's share has decreased and decreased significantly. India continues to transition away from Russia as an arms supplier, and U.S. imports are only likely to, and they're only going to continue to increase. Now, India doesn't want to be put on the spot by me, let alone by the United States officially, with regard to U.S. unease about India's relationship with Russia. India has a relationship with Russia. The United States has its talking points that oppose that. But when I look at the longer term trends, for example, in arms sales, what I see is that the virtue signaling of American diplomats pestering India about Russia aside, India is moving in the right direction from the standpoint of the United States. And therefore, we should do nothing rhetorically to back India into a corner. Now, of course, with regard to the Khalistan issue, and with regard to the fact that those whom many in India consider to be terrorists, and I also consider to be terrorists, seek shelter in Canada and also in the United States, this can be a source of great antagonism in relations. But in contrast to Justin Trudeau in Canada, and we've seen another outrage today, the fact of the matter is, quietly, the United States is also doing the right thing. I note that Senator Benjamin Cardin from my state of Maryland, from which I talked to you today, was not able to hold back the MQ-9 Reaper that he was threatening to put on hold its transfers to India, simply because not only did he not have the support of Republicans in the United States, he found that he did not have the support of Democrats or even the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. That said, this is an issue I worry about in the future. We can debate the Gaza-Israel conflict at another point in time. But what is clear is that the protests which have erupted in the United States on college campuses have not been spontaneous. They've been pre-planned by a number of foundations, the Open Society Foundation, Tides Foundation, and so forth, Plowshares Foundation. But they've also been subsidized by other countries, for example, Qatar and the Qatar Foundation. Just yesterday, it was revealed that my alma mater, Yale University, had revealed about $250,000 worth of grants from Qatar, but had somehow, contrary to United States law, withheld the fact that they had received another $20 million from Qatar. And of course, there's a direct proportion between Qatari donations and the ability and those who are going out to protest, sometimes violently, on our university campuses and elsewhere. The reason I bring this up is if there are concessions made in the voice of these very loud protests, it would not surprise me if the same tactics were used by some foundations as well as some countries in the Middle East against India. We've already seen a rise in Hinduphobia. We've seen a demonization of power and popularity of some leaders. And India should be on guard for the fact that the same sort of propaganda operation, which is being played out against Israel today, could just as easily be played out against India unfairly. Now, the last thing I would say, and I don't need to continue for 15 minutes, but as I look to the future, one issue that strikes me is ever since China voided its agreements and asserted much greater control over Hong Kong, many of the Western businesses, which once called Hong Kong their home, which once used Hong Kong as their base, banking, consulting, other international businesses, have transferred to Singapore. And when I drive around Singapore, I mean, look, real estate is through the roof in Singapore. It always has been, but even more so now. New construction is readily evident as people are falling over themselves to relocate from Hong Kong and find a safe place to do business. Now, Singapore may be safe in terms of security, but it has the same vulnerability to China that Hong Kong does. And I mean, Singaporeans would be the first to tell you this, which makes me wonder why in the future, as we talk about self-interest and symbiosis, India is not doing more to capture that sort of Hong Kong portion of the market, as China shoots itself in the foot by, even against the backdrop of demographic decline, ruining its business opportunities and its business environment. Why not have India really work overtime to capture that profit to the advantage of India, to the advantage of the West, and to the advantage of the international liberal order? And with that, let me stop and turn the floor back.
Thank you, Michael. You have brought out several important points, and one of the indices that you used for judging the relationship is through the arms sales. And indeed, USA is our second or third largest supplier now, and the greater closeness in this area is growing. But at the same time, as you know, that being a very legalistic country, sometimes it's taken with a pinch of salt as well. But it's true, it's got bound to increase in times to come, and in India's quest for technology and indigenization, which we call as Atmanirbhar, grows further. And I was happy to see that the US companies and the US is looking at manufacturing in India also, because that's a self-reliance initiative of India is quite important. Another very important point that you mentioned about the way these various foundations have operated during the Israel-Hamas war and the campus disquiet that is witnessed nowadays. And you mentioned about Qatar, but Qatar also happens to be your non-NATO ally, and which US depends a great deal in the region. So how would you reconcile those approaches along with what you say that Qatar has been doing at the campuses against the US interests, so to say? Of course, you are absolutely right. Not only when countries, even the companies which are using China plus one strategy, a very large number of them are moving to Vietnam, to other places. And China has also changed its strategy of investing more in Vietnam. So at the same time, you have cloning of Chinese companies in Vietnam that are operating with the other multinationals and the global companies. So India will have to do much more to attract those companies in India. I fully understand, and I think that this is something we need to do. Thank you so much. Now I would like to invite Dr. Kaushara to share his views on the Indo-US relationship and how do we take it forward.
Well, again, thanks, Anil, and thanks to the foundation for the invitation. It's good to be here with Kamal and Richard. Let me give my few thoughts, to probably a little bit more broad, because there are so many issues, as was mentioned, but get into we could be talking till the end of the day. I would say there are three broad sort of drivers, or at least considerations, framing issues in US-India relationship. One is between the old and the new. So I think the history and the future, I think it'd be useful, and I'm speaking more to our young colleagues here, because the rest of us have heard each other speak for a long time. So there's certainly a history, and the history is one where both countries have enough to sort of pause for trusting each other to the greatest degree. And you can go as easy as all the way to the partition, through the Pakistan days, and on Bangladesh, and on to the recent Afghan stuff. And then there is the future. And the future is to say, okay, what are the drivers today? And what are the concerns and national interest as we go forward? So I think this will be helpful to keep in mind, because the history should certainly inform the future, but the future is what sort of more directs where the relationship goes and all that. So that's one issue. We can talk about it, their Q&A. The other one is core and peripheral issues. So there are immensely core issues. There are core national interest issues between the two countries. Everything from sharing an adversary to more on the positive, affirmative side of looking at the future. And quite bluntly, I may put the two ones that were sort of implied in Anil's comments. One is that both US and India are each other's indispensable partners in sort of rebutting or deterring, as Kamal said, and I think that's the right term, deterring, China's hegemonic sort of designs within the Anil mentioned, which is that the present sort of so-called world order, rules-based, it certainly needs to be updated. with the more sort of modern political, economic, security landscape. And again, both India and the US would be each other's indispensable partners in being able to do that. So those are the core interests. Peripheral issues, Kamal well through it. He likes to go through all of them. So I think there's a whole bunch of them. I think everybody can go on a lot of issues, which are sort of, I think an important one that Anil mentioned in his up issue was criticism of sort of Indian democracy, the complete misunderstanding of NATO on the India side. So there are a lot of issues which are can be on the periphery, and we can, including something that Richard mentioned, which is pretty useful. I mean, there is conceivably and sort of concerning element of identity politics, both in India and in US in different ways. Your opposition wants to have a survey based on caste. We are convinced about Black Lives Matter, so then pretty much every sort of infinite characteristic individually that can sort of divide us in any possible way. Whether we go to the India the same way we went around Gaza issues, who knows? I think Gaza issue is completely a white, brown, white, black issue, a racial issue. So it hasn't come up in Ukraine and Sudan and in Uyghur because it doesn't fit the bill as well. I don't know if that fits the bill India or not going forward. So that's, I think, one. So I think national interest, and then I would say that it has been remarkably well handled. I mean, there's all things, and as Kamal said, relationships come in good and bad. That may be an Indian phraseology. I phrase it by core and peripheral. So there should be no bad in core interest. And I couldn't care less about bad and peripheral. You can go write a lot of books, give a lot of talks, but there ought not to be any bad in the core interest. So no, I don't say India relation comes with good and bad. I say India relations comes with core and peripheral issues. So you got to sort of keep that in mind as we go forward in this. And so again, there is a certain amount of emotional part that comes in, but core interests are there, and they have been handled remarkably well, both under Trump and under Biden administration. And Michael is absolutely right. The question that Anil said, what happens with Trump coming in? I think who knows, but the probability are that, you know, I would say 80-90% the relationship continues as is. And President Trump enjoys a good personal rapport with Prime Minister Modi, so that speaks well. And particularly the continuity on the Indian side, I think, speaks well. Now, there were sort of three other issues that were coming to deals. One was, let's just take sort of India's global priorities, so to speak. I mean, an obvious one is it's, I think, much needed, much later than needed to be, but much, much welcome and deserved, is the Indian economy's ascendancy to become the third largest economy in the world by the end of this decade. I think that's probably ought to be the priority number one. Again, for all the reasons that was mentioned earlier, whether it be trade, whether it be defense production, America has an important role to play in India helping that priority. That's the core interest. The core interest, again, is that the India need to sort of tighten the gap, both economic and militarily, with its primary adversary, which is China. So I think also I would say that somewhat Pakistan issues, you know, they may not be as peripheral, but certainly they're not as core as China. So I think we can talk about Pakistan. I don't want to derail it largely because it'll counter my point. I don't want to waste time talking Pakistan. I think we should talk China for both ends of these things. So I think that's there. And so India's ability to close the gap economically and militarily vis-a-vis China, which it needs to do for its own interest. Also, America can play an important role, and it helps America as well. And the third one we already alluded to, which is that we do need to update the so-called international rules-based order. And again, both the largest democracy, the oldest democracy, the largest economy, the third largest economy have a strong role to play. So those are the three core interests, but I think people ought to keep an eagle eye on as we talk about a lot of other issues that come into play. The relationship is getting amazingly wide. So there's the scope of the relationship has widened substantially. I don't think that there is any other relationship. Again, I would disagree slightly with Michael, not disagree, but probably add to it, that there are other countries that also bipartisanly we are 100% irrespective, either way it comes in, will be strong. Japan is our numero one, so I think we'll be strong in Japan, irrespective how the things blows one way or the other. UK and Israel also kind of on a similar board. So I think India is there as well. But the relationship has substantially widened, even with Japan or Israel or UK. The scope of the partnership between India and US is the widest of them all, even wider than all of them put together. So everything from defense to agriculture to solar to pharmaceuticals to AI to tech. I mean, you name it. That width is pretty much unmatched of any other nation. Again, a core interest. Where we need to go is to take this relationship deeper. So I think it's what we say about a mile wide, and it might be an inch or a foot.
We lost you, Kosh. Can you hear us? Kosh, can you rejoin?
I'll also
Yeah.
tell you away 5 questions at us very quickly.
Yeah, we
Short
lost you
answer,
in the
then you
middle,
ask
actually. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think that was because I was reveling in irrelevance. So the AI decided that they ought to cut it. Anyway, I don't know where you lost me, but we can come back to it if there was.
You said that to make it deeper, the relationship. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, make it deeper. Okay, then I'll come back to the end. Let me answer your specific questions. So you said a little bit about what happens, how does the election affect the relationship? I think I'd second Michael's point that I don't expect that to affect it much one way or the other. It was related to war, the couple of situation. Here, I couldn't more possibly go. US and India's military convergence, even if we had any Anil can share it. There'll be 40 Yes, in India's interest and US's is that if there was any engagement vis-a-vis Taiwan or China Sea, India's main role is sort of cover the flank and do it in the Indian Ocean. It's not that used to South Sea. First, it doesn't have the capacity, and the second, it can be a much more important role. So if my colleagues actually tell us another opine on the other issue, which I think from a wide, sane man to give such a rather incredible statement of a bad bet because of Taiwan, I would agree more with him and could agree more with Campbell in the idea of the Indian Ocean attitude. I think that would be a main issue. As for how much we got, I think any Russian military already knows how much and how valuable that is. It can certainly be exceeded, but there's a sea change would be an understatement of that is going. As far as derailment, you said, so there are a lot of efforts, and again, I would second what Mike said. You can already see in how the US government is facing which would have, sort of these detracting issues. Some of them are not minor, like the one that Michael alluded to, both in Canada and the US. Some of which are uninformed, which are the sort of democracy criticism within India, within the Western press of India. But the way the government has handled it as a sense of both maturity of themselves, but also the maturity of the relationship. And if we were to deepen this relationship further, that's the best way to make the relationship immune to these sort of distractions. So where I was ending with, and it might have got cut, I will repeat it for 2 minutes and then turn it back to you. I just said, having said all that, my only one bit was focus on core interest, focus on future, let history inform the relationship, do not forget the history, but the people who need to drive the relationship forward need to be the younger generation with a more positive articulation and unburdened with all the trivialities of history as we go forward. And I hope the people in the crowd are the ones I'm looking at. I'll stop there and answer any questions that either I didn't answer or anything else you got. Over, back to you.
Thank you, Coach. Thank you very much for very clearly outlining and giving, examining and for offering your argument on the basis of the old and the new and the historical context, as well as the future drivers and the future drivers of the relationship. And you basically distinguish between the core and the peripheral issues, and that going from sharing in adversities to what can be the indispensable partners do together. And of course, we do have issues, but they have to be handled with great maturity. And going forward, the relationship needs to become more deeper, and that's the core message that you're continuing, and that will be the best way to avoid the distractions and creating greater trust. So, as you say, the government has handled maturely, but even as you know that today alone, some of the senators and congressmen have introduced, written a letter actually in the Congress about this Pannu case, which is becoming increasingly more in the mainstream rather than just something that came out by uninformed people. So, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. Now, I think we have some questions, and are they in the chat box? Yeah. There is a question to Ambassador Sibbal, which says about US lawmakers met with Dalai Lama in India today. Obviously, it's a US strategy to counter China. What will be India's stance, be considering that China opposes such meetings? Also, I would like to hear your comment on whether India will be able to bring up the issue of Oxygen primarily, since India has raised the topic of POK multiple times, even during the recent election.
Well, firstly, Nancy Pelosi has visited India before and met the Dalai Lama. This is nothing new. Other Americans have also come and visited him. The question that arises is whether India either should not have let her come because of China's sensitivities, or as some commentators from India have said, that the fact that she made a statement in Dharamsala was a provocation to China, and India should not have allowed it. Now, my counter to that is that it's utterly ridiculous to think that we could have denied visas to Nancy Pelosi or the congressman who accompanied her, or having given visas to them, we had made a precondition that they should not make any public statement. Now the very same people who are criticizing today Modi government for this would have blasted the Modi government to say that you have bent before China, you are trying to appease China, that you are not allowing the Americans to exercise freedom of speech. And on this freedom of speech business, they would have gone to town against the Modi government. Now, the point is that when, let's say, Shahbaz Sharif visited China recently, in the joint statement, there is a reference to Kashmir. And nothing stops Shahbaz Sharif to make statements on Kashmir on Chinese soil. The Chinese ambassador sitting in India have actually made claims on Arunachal Pradesh, vast claims on Arunachal Pradesh. The foreign Western leaders have come to India repeatedly and have spoken about our relationship with Russia, criticizing it, even going to the point of saying that we should be on the right side of history. We should reduce our military ties with Russia. The Western ambassadors sitting in Delhi are given platforms in our press to express themselves against the policy of the Indian government, but India is in no position to stop them. And if we were, as I said, there'll be hullabaloo about Modi government once again being intolerant and suppressing freedom of speech. Now, why should we do diplomatic work on behalf of China? If the Americans want to raise the Tibet issue in the way they want to raise, it is not for us to stop that and do diplomatic work on behalf of China and shield China. If China has a problem, let them say what they want to say, as they have said already against what she said in Dharamsala, and they have blasted Dalai Lama in the process. So I don't think that this is something that we need to worry about. After all, why do we have a territorial problem with China? It's because they militarily occupied Tibet, and based on their military occupation of Tibet, they have made territorial claims on India. So Tibet is at the core of our relationship with China, and therefore any pressure that can come from any direction to resolve this issue peacefully and give Tibetans their rights, we should support it, even if we don't want to say anything actively, because we have accepted Tibet as part of China. Why should we stand in the way of other countries raising the human rights issue of the Tibetans, or talking about Tibetan autonomy, which is very crucial insofar as we are concerned, because China is militarily occupying Tibet. They have strengthened their military presence in Tibet to such an extent that they are posing a direct danger to us. With regard to Aksai Chin, of course, we have made statement. Our Home Minister has made a statement in Parliament to say that Aksai Chin is a part of India, to which the Chinese reacted very sharply. So we have maintained our position that China is in illegal occupation of large swaths of our territory in Ladakh, primarily the Aksai Chin area. And the problems we are having in that area, Depsang plains and everything else, is all related to Chinese occupation of the Aksai Chin. So it's not an issue that we are not raising.
Ambassador Tribunal, are you here?
Mr.
But I can.
Are you there?
Yeah. Okay, sorry,
Yes.
there was a power cut here.
Okay.
Yeah, please go ahead, Kosh.
Yeah, let me follow up on something. That,
Well,
first of all, I second everything that Constable said. But one more thing, I think one of the things which is both countries to sort of understand each other is really to see the world from each other's perspective. Now, we have come to a point where some people make that point, but I haven't seen that many people who actually do it. Both countries feel they're unique. Of course, it's frustrating for among any people, individuals or countries. You need to see from each other's perspective. So I think, and I must just tell you the two areas why this Tibet issue becomes relevant, because Tibet issue is very relevant because it is similar to in Ukraine and what would go to a great extent, and Macron is number one of them. Since somebody quoted that genius, that that of course America should spend both money to pressure people in Ukraine, but money for Ukrainian Taiwan is not really a European issue. So the fascinating, the people who are on the front lines of Taiwan are the first to jump up and say the solidarity with Ukraine because they see it similar to theirs. So the countries that came out, Ukraine, whether it be Japan, and of course, so I'm not saying good, bad, or ugly. We can spend a lot of time going back and forth, especially in calling me, perhaps. But the point being that as we mature this relationship, it'd be interesting to see how each other sees it, and because that's how we compare. And those are very important when we go about so reordering the rules-based order and everything. So I see the thing. I couldn't agree more with Kamal as the way that went, but these are related issues. Sooner we sort of have some convergence of perspective on it, the stronger we will be collectively. Over.
Thank you. Abhinav?
I have a question for Dr. Rubin. Dr. Rubin, thank you so much for your interesting remarks first. Yes, so if President Trump comes to power, like Mr. Trump comes to power, what do you see happening to the Ukraine war? Like, how is that going to? Is there anything going to change on that front?
It's a great question. I'm a historian, so I get paid to predict the past. And my critics would say I only get that right 50% of the time. I'm not sure whether I can predict the future here. There is some argument made among Republicans that despite Trump's rhetoric, that the Trump administration was actually tougher on Russia than the Biden administration has been. Ultimately, let me punt the question this way. I think so much depends on who Trump's picks for key positions, for example, Secretary of Defense or National Security Advisor will be. The biggest difference between the previous Trump administration and a potential Trump version 2.0 is that whatever position Trump takes, there will be less of a learning curve among his appointees, and therefore, for better or for worse, they are going to be much more efficient in maneuvering the gears of power in the United States. The other issue is, look, from Washington's perspective, the world revolves around us. Whether Democrats or Republicans, too many in Washington navel gaze. We just, as Kosh implied, we simply see the world through our own perspective. The reason I bring this up, and Kosh is absolutely correct, is because to make peace, it's going to take two sides. And I'm not sure that Vladimir Putin has shown any sincere interest in coming to terms with Ukraine and its existence as an independent entity. So even if Trump wanted to end this conflict, I'm not sure that it would be in his power to do so, as we're not the only group supporting Ukraine. I hate to say this. I also think that this is a war over demography. And one of the questions will be, who runs out first? Military-age Ukrainians or military-age Russians?
Dr. Rubin, there is another question for you, which is what are the specific areas in which US and India could possibly work together in South China Sea to counter Chinese expansionist policy? This has been discussed by both Ambassador Sibbal and Dr. Kosh also. But what's your view on this?
Look, I mean, my view on this is the greater the cooperation, the continuity of the exercises, the more we have interoperability. That itself is a deterrent over any unilateral actions in the region. Ultimately, rather than be reactive, which automatically puts us at a disadvantage, I do think we need to be proactive. And that also includes interoperability with other countries, for example, Japan. One of my greatest concerns is if there is a massive attack on Taiwan, the United States would respond with its Navy. Now, because so many of our ships could be within range of Chinese missiles and hypersonic missiles, this means that we are going to respond more with naval aviation. But 90% of our naval aviation jet fuel is stored in Singapore and therefore would be vulnerable to a Chinese first strike. Therefore, it would behoove us to have a serious discussion, should there be aggression, what sort of supply chain would we need to maintain? Now, having such discussions is not provocative. It's just common sense. But before I turn the floor back, and also, I'm sorry, I'm not one who believes that China is going to go into Taiwan in a big way. I think what China is much more likely to do is go after Taiping Island or some of the other outlying islands, Matsu, Quemoy, because they aren't even, the United States doesn't define them as within the Taiwan Relations Act. And therefore, I suspect we're going to see more salami slicing. I should also say that if China decided to make any serious move in the South China Sea, it's not necessarily going to do that at the expense or forgetting about its own claims with regard to its aggression and its salami slicing in Indian territory. And therefore, one of the best issues the United States could do right now is to listen to India and work with India to talk about what it needs in order to defend its frontiers with China as Chinese aggression continues to go. With regard to the last question about Nancy Pelosi provocation and all that sort of thing, two other quick issues. Look, there should be no doubt that Aksai Chin is Indian territory, and if the United States is truly going to respect India as a partner, we need to recognize this unequivocally as Indian territory. None of this disputed territory nonsense. None of these dotted lines on a map. That's point one. My second point, when we talk about Tibet and the Dalai Lama, is we can't be blind to the fact that China has gone around the region setting up fake Buddhist organizations, trying to co-opt Buddhism in a way where when it comes time for succession, China is going to try to confuse succession with its own puppet Buddhist organizations, which is the utmost cynicism, given the destruction which China has wrought upon Buddhism and Tibet itself. The United States with India need to be clear about what is legitimate and what is not legitimate in this regard. So, yes, your question was about the South China Sea, but unfortunately, there's as my old PhD advisor Paul Kennedy used to talk about nonstop, the seamless web of history. And we need to recognize, just because our own Pentagon wants to look at things in isolation, that's not the way the world works.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much for that very important comment that you made about various things that needs to be done. So there is knowledge about issues that are there and how to be handled. Hopefully they listen to your advice in this. Ambassador Sibal, there is a question again from one lady Shubhi Sharma, that India has dropped the one China policy in the statements with China since 2020, but we still do not have a Taiwan policy, and Tibet is never used as a card against China. Will we see India have a Taiwan policy in the future, or the use of Tibet as a leverage with China?
Well, insofar as using Tibet as a lever is concerned, it is much too late. In 1954, we recognized Tibet effectively as part of China. And since then, we've been making statements in our joint communiques whenever there have been high-level visits that we considered Tibet as part of China, and we supported the One China policy all along until Sushma Swaraj made the point, which I had been making separately on my own. Naturally, I was not a policy maker and couldn't dictate what government should do, but I was happy that she finally said that unless China supports a One India policy, there's no reason for India to support a One China policy. And the message was clear that so long as you maintain your territorial claims on India, which means that you don't accept a One China policy, One India policy, you don't accept even Kashmir as part of integral part of India, and question the McMahon line in the east, then there is no reason for us to support your claims on Taiwan or anything else. Insofar as reviving the Tibetan card is concerned, I think it's a bit too late. Though in a different way it can be, and I've been recommending it should be, but it's for Government of India to take the decision and to see what the repercussions of that would be. It's firstly, why are we politically ignoring the Dalai Lama? Now, why can't the Dalai Lama make an official call on our president or on our prime minister, especially, let's say, if it's Buddha Purnima or any big Buddhist festival? There's good reason for him as a spiritual leader of Buddhism to come and engage our prime minister. I had recommended that he should have been there at the swearing-in ceremony of our prime minister now and in 2019, but this has not happened. There's nothing wrong with this. But point is, the mistake we make is that when China makes a serious provocation on Arunachal Pradesh or on Jammu and Kashmir, staple visas and this and that, we should immediately do something to give more recognition to the Dalai Lama. If we don't do it immediately and do it after 4 months, then it looks as if we have taken the initiative to provoke China. But we should play it in a manner that we are reacting to a provocation of China, which we don't do. Why we don't do, I think it's the policymakers that have to be asked. With regard to Taiwan, I have visited Taiwan and I have some understanding of what the ASEAN countries, for example, do with regard to Taiwan. I'm not talking about United States and others. They have much more interaction with Taiwan than we do, in the sense that we don't even do as much with Taiwan as the ASEAN countries do. So we are hesitant. We've been very reluctant to invite Taiwanese ministers to India officially. Since we want to increase our trade ties and our investment ties with Taiwan, why not invite their ministers to head a delegation of Taiwanese businessmen? But I suppose Government of India feels that when they do the sums of this, probably they feel that we may not be able to get as much out of this as we may wish, and in fact provoke China without necessarily obtaining countervailing points in our favor. Of course, in this, see, the other thing which people don't point out and I don't underline is that it's the Republic of China. It's Chiang Kai-shek, who made the territorial claims on India. So we would want Taiwan to frontally recognize Arunachal Pradesh as an integral part of China, of India, as well as recognize our border in Ladakh. But they haven't done it. So if they did it, then the ground could be clear. Well, I had spoken to the Taiwanese representative a couple of years ago on this, and their argument was that, we've said that the two sides should resolve this issue bilaterally, which is an indirect way of resiling from our past position, but that's not good enough. But nevertheless, I think, especially since we want the Taiwanese to come and help us set up a semiconductor industry and this and that, I think some way should be found to step up our political engagement with Taiwan, go a little beyond the economic engagement. But this again should be done as a reaction to a Chinese provocation, rather than a studied proposal a studied move on our part, at some point in time when there is nothing that China has done to provoke us. Then it would seem as if we are upping the ante, rather than sending a message to China and the international community that enough is enough. We have been a series of provocations by China, but now we have taken a certain step. Anyway, it's for the policymakers to decide, but these are my views.
You're right, sir. China will continue to give us a lot of opportunities, but how do we take it and how do we respond to the question? And you're absolutely right. I think this was a very important point you made about Chiang Kai-shek and their claims on the Indian territory. So I think some initiatives should come from there. But what we hear now, as far as the investments are concerned, is that one of the biggest lag that there is that the Taiwanese representative told me that we continue to treat Taiwan, and in terms of the customs regulations and others, as everything coming from China. So they become quite non-competitive in India. So that has been one of their major grounds in this for increasing trade and investment in India. Well, I think that there was a question about Quad. I think that Quad India's position is very clear. But at the same time, I think there's another Squad has come up now, which is a more security-oriented organization. So Shubhi, you can look that up. We are at the closing point now, so I'll thank the esteemed speakers for sharing such wide and deep knowledge of theirs onto various issues. And the idea is that this is a relationship which is very, very important, especially for India in the technological domain, as India wishes to go up the ladder. And so thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. And I'll pass on back to Abhinav.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Trigunayat. Recently, I read an interview of John Mearsheimer, and in one of his recent interviews to Indian Express, he said that the India-US relationship is more like a marriage of convenience, and it's based on the China factor. It's due to the China factor that both the countries are coming closer. However, if we look at this issue and then ask a question, this is a very pertinent question which is being asked in most of the IR circles and military circles these days, that what can the US do if there is any situation between China and India? Let's say hypothetically a situation of a conventional war or something like that. Now, given the situations on the ground, particularly in the eastern part of India, in the Ladakh region, it's a very hilly terrain, very undulating terrain. So there are limitations. Mostly infantry is going to be of use there. There are certain areas where the wheeled equipment can be used. So most of the experts who have some field knowledge, they would conclude that it's the intelligence in which US can be of some crucial help to India. Apart from that, the majority of our equipment, whether we want to accept it or not, but we have to admit that it's Russian, most of our tanks and all. So there are limitations, particularly in this conventional clash between India and China. And so there is no question of the US landing its troops there. Perhaps we don't even need that, because Indian troops and Indian army is much better hardened, and we have a very long experience of fighting in those heights. Again, in another domain, what China can really try to target India is in the cyber domain. So once again, if situations really go worse, once again, there's a limitation to which US can help India. So having said that, the point that I want to make is that, I mean, if we try to look at India-US relationship only from this China-centric prism, then there are major handicaps and major limitations. So this relationship doesn't have to be based on some of these conditionalities like China or the other conditionality that India has to bring down its ties with Russia. We cannot do that. India is a civilizational state, and we certainly do not subscribe to this very transactional style of diplomacy. I guess to have a firm footing of, to have a much robust and a much stronger partnership with the US, this relationship needs to have its own standing, which has to be very deep rooted, and it has to be based on a very strong mutual trust. So I guess we should be working towards that angle. That's the last point which I would really wanted to make. But I would like to thank all our esteemed speakers today for joining us today. Ambassador Kanwal Sibal, we wanted to invite you for a very long time. I have read your expert opinions and pieces in various news portals, and they are always a great learning experience for me. Mr. Kaushara, thank you very much for joining us today. And Dr. Rubin, once again, it was a pleasure having you with us. And finally, Ambassador Trigunayat, without you, now Usanas, for Usanas, you're like a family member, and it cannot support, it cannot function, it cannot work without your support and blessings. Thank you very much for joining us again today. And definitely, I mean, I would also like to thank all the participants on the Usanas team. We'll be soon coming up with another event very soon. Before I end, I would like to just speak a few words about the Usanas Scholars Program that we are launching very soon. Every year we launch this, we conduct this Usanas Scholars Program, and we have different themes every year. This year, our main theme is going to be on terrorism and radicalization. As today, India's major challenge is 2.54. The two parts we all know, it's China and Pakistan, but the 0.5 element is internal. So terrorism and radicalization, they constitute like very critical components of that 0.54. So this is something which is very critical to us. And also internationally, terrorism and non-state actors, they continue to pose a great threat to the human civilization. So we will be addressing and discussing different modules in that pertaining to terror financing, radicalization, Islamism in the West, rise of ISKP in South Asia. I promise that this is going to be a great learning experience and a very enriching experience for our fellows. So I'll encourage all of you to register for the program. And thank you very much once again. Thanks for joining.